So good morning to all of our live attendees today. We are thrilled you're here to engage in this exciting webinar, The Role of Peer Support and Harm Reduction in Integrated Care. I'm Dr. Tiffany O'Shaughnessy, and I'm one of the hosts of our webinar today. I use the pronouns she, her, and I'm a white cisgender woman in my early 40s with an undercut buzzed hair on my left side and chin-length purple hair on my right side. I'm wearing a black top, and my background is an office with a fiddle leaf fig, a beige couch, and a blue floral painting. I'm a professor and the MFT program coordinator in the Department of Counseling here at San Francisco State. I am one of the co-investigators for this project, and I'm working alongside the project's primary investigator, Dr. Julie Cronister, who's our department chair, and my co-investigator, Dr. Molly Streer, who's the coordinator of our school counseling program. I would also like to thank our graduate assistant, Jace Perry, who is working hard to stay on top of the technical issues, chat boxes, etc. today. I'd like to acknowledge that SF State's campuses in San Francisco sit on the ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone. We further acknowledge that we work on the ancestral lands and waters of many other Indigenous peoples and nations in our fieldwork in the Bay Area and around the world. We also acknowledge the enslaved peoples, primarily of African descent, whose labor built many of the facilities that we gather in and those of the United States. To move the statement from acknowledgement to action, we encourage you to learn more about the Ohlone people and lend your time, talent, and other resources and service in whatever ways you deem right and true for you. We're committed to ensuring this webinar is accessible to our audiences. Closed captioning is available in the closed captioning option at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If at any time your access needs are not met or become not met during the webinar, please send a chat directly to a host or co-host. Access is always a work in progress, so we appreciate your comments, feedback, and support. This is our fourth webinar of the year, sponsored by our Equity and Justice Focused Integrated Behavioral Health Counselor Training Project, which is fully funded by the Department of Health and Human Services, Health Resources and Services Administration, as part of an award totaling $1.9 million. The contents are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official views of, nor an endorsement by HRSA, HHS, the Department of Education, or the U.S. government. A couple of additional things before we begin. If you are one of our HRSA stipend recipients or are interested in receiving continuing education credit for your attendance today, please pay close attention to the announcements provided in the chat for sign-in and evaluation links. Our thanks to our partner, Counseling and Psychological Services at UC Berkeley, who are approved by the American Psychological Association to sponsor continuing education credits. As a reminder, this is a live recorded Zoom webinar, therefore the audience isn't visible and the audience can't turn on their video or audio. The chat function is available for comments, sharing of resources, supportive emojis, etc. To ask the presenter a specific question, please post your question in the Q&A function. Q&A will occur during the last 10 to 15 minutes of the webinar, so please post your questions in Q&A as they emerge, and the presenter will answer questions at the end of it. If we can't get to all of them, we'll ask you to contact the presenter directly, and her information will be posted in the chat. And so with all of that, it is with great pleasure that I introduce today's presenter, Sera Davidow. Sera Davidow is a mother, activist, author, trainer, and filmmaker. For the last 17 years, she's worked as a part of the leadership team for the Wildflower Alliance, formerly known as the Western Mass Recovery Learning Community. She is also a founding member of the Hearing Voices Board USA and writes regularly for Mad in America. Her particular areas of expertise include trauma, suicide, voice hearing, self-injury, anti-oppression work, and more. We are so honored to get to spend the next hour learning from her. Thank you again, Sera, for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to talking to everyone about this topic of peer support and also really about how it intersects with social justice. And so that's actually where I'm going to start. Well, there's some disclosures that you've already really heard. So that's on your screen now, but also the learning objectives, which I believe are on the website for you if you want to check them. But where I really want to start is talking about that intersection of being someone with a psychiatric history, peer support, social injustice. And this is actually an exercise that I do in trainings. And I just want to kind of give you a snapshot of going through this experience. And if we were in a room, a smaller room together, I would actually ask people to speak during this part, but I'm just going to kind of go through what's on the screen, and then I'm going to ask you all to participate silently and see where it gets for us. So the way this exercise starts is to read out each of the squares, and so I'm going to do that. I am number one, I am generally in charge of who I live with or sleep around. Number two, no one is routinely taking notes about what I do during my day and sharing them freely with others. Three, I can get out in the sun or breathe fresh air pretty much whenever I want. Four, if I have a concern or complaint, I can typically expect that people will believe what I say and take me seriously. Number five, if I have a strong emotion, it's usually seen as valid and not spoken of as a symptom or risk factor that is solved just by getting rid of the feeling. Six, I can reasonably expect that there aren't formal meetings that take place to discuss the details of my existence, especially without me present. Seven, I am consistently seen as a credible source for information about my own needs and wants. Eight, if I have a bad habit like smoking, diet, etc., it's unlikely that anyone's going to try to force me to stop it abruptly. Nine, when I tell people about my past, present, and future, I generally get to tell it through my eyes and in my words. 10, if I have, I have regular access to my cell phone, social media, and other ways to connect with people and learn about what's going on for my friends and family or in the world. 11, if I don't want to do something someone else thinks I should do, I can usually avoid doing it without them having power to force me or convince others I am bad or sick for not listening. And 12, I can reasonably expect that most important decisions will be mine to make, and that if others are involved, it will usually be because I've chosen them to play a primary role, like spouse, good friend, etc. Now, here's the part where you come in. I'm going to ask you, you've now heard these out loud, you see them in front of you, to think about briefly which one you're willing to give up first and cross it out in your mind. Were we together, you'd have a sheet of paper in front of you and you'd physically get to draw a line through it. So which one do you give up first? You can also write it in the chat if you'd like. And now that you've figured out which one you're giving up first, I'm going to ask you, which one are you willing to give up second and cross it out? Put it in the chat. And because I know this is easy and you've given up number one and number two without any difficulty, think about which one you're willing to give up third and cross it out. Now, were we in a room and having a longer day together, I might go through all the way to which one are you hanging on to last. But part of what I want you to think about now is, how did that feel? Even though you're not actually giving it up, how did it feel to think about which one of those you would give up first, or second, or third, and so on? And bear in mind then, as you're thinking about those feelings and how that felt, people who enter a psychiatric facility have to give all of those up at the same time, and they don't get any choice. And in fact, not just locked psychiatric facilities, many of those are given up in many different psychiatric treatment environments. And I start here in part because I know that the people who are a part of this work that you're doing are very invested in the social injustice of these environments and how that can play out. But also because with peer support, there's often this misunderstanding that in peer support, we're just relating on the diagnosis we've been given or the distress we might feel, the suicidal thoughts we might have. But in fact, a lot of what ends up happening in peer support worlds, at least peer support worlds where we're really empowered to have real conversations, we're talking about the power we've lost. We're talking about how we were harmed before the system and also by the system. We're talking about how do we navigate this system without being further harmed and still getting our needs met. And those are really challenging conversations. And so I really want to start there. And I also just want to talk a little bit more about the history of the mental health system and the way systemic oppression has shown up. Now, you'll have access to these slides. I am for sure not going to go through all these words, but I put a lot of words on there because you can go back and look at them. But I just want to reflect on the fact that there are many different marginalized experiences represented here, and that the history of the mental health system, while it's not the only purpose the mental health system is served, is often to be used as a tool of oppression. And there's just a certain reality we cannot deny there. Even if we look back to the 1800s and we look at drapetomania, where Samuel Cartwright declared that enslaved people who tried to run away actually had this quote unquote mental illness called drapetomania, and that was the main symptom is they were trying to get away. And dysesthesia aethiopica was also something that was created by Samuel Cartwright. And that one, around the same time, was offered as whether someone was enslaved or not, but generally we're talking about Black people in this country, if they were showing laziness in the fields when they were doing work. That was the diagnosis they got. And I know this is intense to hear, but one of the main symptoms were sores on their back. However, if we think about what happened to people who were seen as lazy when they were supposed to be working, it makes sense that they would have sores on their back. And yet somehow that was allowed to be a psychiatric diagnosis. And we can follow that thread all the way through today in so many different communities, as well as some of the stereotypes that we live with, like that Black or brown people are more lazy. That's some of the root here is within these mental health systems. And I do want to show you a few videos that just capture the fact that this is not just historical, that this is also something that is very present today. And I just want to look at some different topics, like hearing voices, for example, which is really, really strongly described by most places in the system still as something that happens when there's something wrong in someone's brain. So I'm going to play you a short clip from Mark that is out of one of our films called Beyond the Medical Model. Well, let's try that again.
It seems like all my issues stem from social atmosphere, and all the things that I've been through in my life, have been very extreme trauma. The most extreme trauma that affected me was when I was 4.5 in a kindergarten, and I was raised in an environment, where there weren't too many Black people. In kindergarten, I had ended up with a very racist teacher, older. She was very old, and she was stuck in her ways, and I was treated every day for that year. I was treated, as less than. I mean, really like I was an animal or something, and I think that's what had the most extreme effect on me, which continued all my life because I never really dealt with it. And it was so many degrading things that I went through. I believe that's when I started the development of hearing voices.
Now, it's those sorts of experiences that we don't typically hear from mental health providers that as peer supporters we can share with each other and validate in each other and challenge the ways that our experiences have typically been framed. And that's so important. It's also the case that actually research supports this, but it's not the research that people hear most often about. Perhaps you have. It's much more common today that if I say, have you heard of the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, that people are saying yes. That wasn't the case 10 years ago. But there's actually research that we can point to that says, in the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, which involved answering these 10 questions about different traumatic experiences people might have had in childhood, if someone answers 7 or more with a yes, there appears to be a 500% greater likelihood that they might hear voices. So, I hear some of that in Mark's experience. And then, of course, self-injury is a very common topic in the world of mental health, and it's a common topic amongst those of us who are in the peer support world because it's so misunderstood. Self-injury has led for so many of us to involuntarily hospitalizations that represented vast misunderstandings of what self-injury was in our life. And the roots, again, are seen as something going on in our heads, but so much of it is about our lives. So I'm going to play this clip from Jill.
I went from a cohort of less than 30 Haudenosaunee students to being thrust into a cohort of over 300 predominantly white students. It was all these people looking at me, but not truly seeing my history or my culture. This is the first time I cut myself. I carved the word hate into my arm.
Now, I'm somebody who has self-injured for most of my life, starting when I was 11. And it's something that I still to this day, although I haven't done it in a very long time, will never say that I will give up, because the mental health system sent this message that that was the thing that needed to stop, and they weren't interested in why I was doing it. And that caused great harm. It led to involuntary hospitalization for me when I was in my 20s. And I'll be honest that it's only been with other people who have that history of self-injury where I can say, this is my experience, and I don't have to explain it or defend it at length because they have that experience too. It's a very different experience overall. Now, if you have worked in the mental health system or taken a look at how they tend to still honestly do a lot of treatment planning, there's these things called measurable goals. And those measurable goals often don't represent what is most meaningful to people. And sometimes you'll see things in there like, we'll shower 3 times a week. And I just really want to reflect on the reality that, and this is not because mental health providers are in any way bad. And my big sort of dirty secret is that if mental health providers and peer supporters are both really trained and given the space to do the work the way I think we in our hearts really want to do it, doesn't actually look that different. We can be curious with each other, we can explore experiences with each other, but it's so often the systems are pushing providers to do their work in a very different way. And so we see those sorts of goals when in fact, if we actually listen to people about what's going on, we hear stories like the one I'm about to play from Mina.
By the age of 8, I had convinced other kids that my hair was made of sponge because, of course, being black, it couldn't be made of hair. But by 9, my difference started to become more of an embarrassment. And I can remember going on a residential, and on the first night, all the girls had to shower. And I was more developed than my peers, so we get into the showers, and my peers were fascinated by my body. So much so that they took it in turns to run into my shower and to grab me here and to grab me here to see what it felt like. And at the time, I tried to laugh it off, but it was humiliating. And it was so humiliating that for the next 3 days, I didn't wash. And every day, the girls would say, come shower, and I was like, no, I'm not going. And by the 3rd day, I couldn't tell whether they wanted me to shower because they still wanted to grab my hair or to see me naked, or whether it's because I smelt so bad. Because one of my guy friends turned to me and said, Samina, you stink. And I can remember being mute the rest of that day.
So you're hearing Mina talk about both not showering and going silent. I know that clip cut off a little bit at the end, but that's what she was saying. And these are things that are seen as really symptoms in the mental health system. And I've heard many stories, and some of them would be seen as quote unquote weirder by people. There's a person, Ray, who's in the UK, who's huge in the Hearing Voices movement. And when she shares some of her stories, she talks about how she didn't shower for a long time because she felt like there were rays that were going to come in. I forget some of the story, but something to the effect of, there's sort of alien rays that were going to attack her when she was that vulnerable in the shower. And the solution was not to put it in a plan that she would shower. It wasn't to take away privileges. It wasn't to put her in a hospital. It was when her brother was willing to come hold up a X-ray proof blanket while she showered and protect her and stand there. And those are the sort of creative supports and responses that happen so much more frequently in the peer support world because of our shared experiences, because of the curiosity where supporters come with. And honestly, part of it is just because we are free of some of the pressure that providers are under to assess, have measurable goals and all of that. So I want to play you one more video. And this is around violence and anger and how that is treated in these systems, particularly for Black and Brown people, but honestly, for any of us, if we are seen as being difficult. It is not, it usually is intertwined with something that is wrong with us and that needs to be shut out. So I'm going to play one more video. It's a 3-minute video, so it's kind of the longest one. This is with Anita D, who actually was living in California for quite a while, but she's talking here about an experience with a hospitalization that she had in Massachusetts.
And the psych ward says, there is no need to worry. This asylum was built to help you. And just like the straps on the stretcher that you rolled in on, we are going to keep you safe and secured. Notice the locked doors and all the cameras perched in the corners like hawks. We will be watching, but this is all for you. and your well-being. You are sick, anxious, depressed, a danger to yourself. The state told us to hold you for 72 hours, but if you sign this paper, we can pretend your stay here this weekend is voluntary. Friday morning, you will be woken up by strangers in white coats and clipboards. You will be asked again and again and again about why and how you want to kill yourself. Be honest. Remember, you are only here for 3 days, so take advantage of the 5 to 10 minutes you have with the doctors. But understand, he has a list of patients as long as his pay stubs. So you won't be receiving any actual therapy sessions while you're here, but we will recommend them as treatment for after we let you out. Until then, we want you to be comfortable, so sit back, enjoy the plastic furniture and coloring books. We have old radios with no antenna, but the static is still loud enough to drown out the sound of the woman screaming in 2B. That's just Cindy. She just does that sometimes. Well, she didn't always, but she does now, and until we can find the right medication, we are going to keep helping her, just like we want to keep helping you if only you'd let us. It's Friday morning, and you haven't even tried the meds yet. You're still lying to us about holding the knife to your arm like your parents haven't already told us everything. Just be honest and let us help you. Did I mention that the state only recognizes the existence of psychiatric patients Monday through Friday? Meaning the past 48 hours you've spent here didn't even count, meaning we still have time for a breakthrough or a breakdown. This is a good thing. This means we still have time to help you. And I can see that you're getting upset, but do not walk away from me with tears streaming and knuckles buried in palms. That type of body language is aggressive, and we might have to do something about that. A sedative, maybe diazepam. Perhaps I don't think being alone is best for you right now. Maybe you should spend time with the other patients. Get to know how they got here. Listen to them when they tell you you got lucky getting placed in this psych ward. We are one of the good ones, and we want you to stay here. We figure if we keep you long enough, maybe you'll eventually start to fit in, or maybe if we keep you locked up, you'll eventually start to act out, and we will be right here waiting to prescribe you something to label you with the diagnosis. We didn't cause your social anxiety. We only heightened what was already there. We just want to see you reach your full potential as a patient. We told you this asylum was built to help you.
So I love watching Anita's video. It's very powerful for those of us particularly who have been in those psychiatric units because the experience is so common. I think sometimes people are kind of given the impression that the horror stories that they hear are the exceptions. And the reality is, I think many people who are in the mental health system have a mix of good and bad experiences, but these experiences of psychiatric units, although not the same across the board, have some very similar features. And one of them is often that it's more about containment and control than it is about support and treatment. Now, that doesn't mean for those of you who are going into this field that that's hopeless. Because sometimes what you'll hear is that one person on the unit, whether they were another person being held there or a person working there that believed in me, that listened to me, that asked me questions no one else was asking, like that potential is huge for people to make a difference, even in very, very difficult environments. And in the peer support world, I will say, often those questions come easier because of those shared experiences. I will say, if you can see the wall behind me, so there's this blue wall with different magazines and then this one piece in the center there. I'll just share one quick story about the difference that people in provider roles have made, not peer roles, in people's lives. So the piece that's in the center there, it's actually cut up pieces of someone's psychiatric file. And so it's a woman, Dorothy Dundas, who's actually one of the last living survivors of insulin shock therapy. And she had a provider who was willing to meet with her and allow her to see her psychiatric file. And then he went to the bathroom to give her some time with her file, which he wasn't supposed to do. And she stole every other page of it so as to not get him in trouble because he wasn't returning with nothing. She just took some of it and she used it and made this poster. And so that was a situation where a provider was really, really helpful in doing something very much not within the role, the role as it's defined. But it was so empowering because so much of what we're talking about, so much of what I've shown you is about loss of power and control. And that is unfortunately, in people's best intentions, sometimes what ends up happening in these systems. And peer supporters have a really instrumental role very often in using the power they've gained, combined with the understanding they have of what these systems are like, to use that power under people rather than over people. And that's a huge difference. So when I say that, rather than controlling someone, using the power that peer supporters have gone under people to sort of lift up their voice, sometimes a voice that's been crushed out for a long time through institutionalization, is a huge part of what peer support is. So if you ever find yourself in an environment where people are talking about how, yeah, it's just about putting two people with the same diagnosis together so they can talk about the experience of that diagnosis, that's a part of it. But that environment is missing something. That might be a sign that there's been a co-optation of peer support if that's all people are talking about. Now, there's also this potential to just create complete alternatives within the peer support world, and one of them is peer respites. There are actually not that many peer respites in this country. There's 3 or 4 dozen that are kind of coming and going. And California is one of the places where there are more. Also, you'll see the cluster where we are in New England. We have had a peer respite at the Wildflower Alliance since 2012 and are actually in process of opening finally our second one. And our second one's going to be an affinity peer respite, which means that it's focused on a particular marginalized community. And in this case, it's going to be the first trans and queer peer respite in the world, as far as we know. And we're really excited about opening that. It will be open at the end of this month, finally. Now, it's a scary time to be doing that work, I'll be honest as well. But I think in the peer support community, where so much of our work is combined with reclaiming power and getting our voices heard and pushing back against systems, when people ask me like, well, shouldn't you be quieter about that? Should you maybe do it underground rather than above ground? I think our attitude right now is if we go silence, then we've lost half of the battle already. And we're not willing to do that until we absolutely have to. There's a quote we put on our Instagram recently that was something to the effect of don't comply in advance. And that's what we're hanging on to. So one of the reasons I bring this up, though, is that another way that the mental health system and systemic oppression intersect are in who gets credit for things. So now peer respites, they are, just for those of you who are unfamiliar, they are 24/7, generally houses, but they can be apartments as well, but home-like environments that have no clinical component. Everyone, including leadership, are people who have psychiatric histories or histories of problems with substances, all the different kinds of experiences that might intersect there. And we create these environments where they're really not focused on clinical, but we can have all these other hugely impactful conversations and experiences together and move through and examine how one of the things we say is like it's an opportunity to turn crisis into a learning opportunity. And that can be really, really powerful. But who gets credit for peer respite in our world is interesting. I actually, some years ago, I was asked to speak at our local Department of Mental Health area director's retirement party, and they said, now tell them that she was instrumental, like she's the one who brought peer respites to this area. And I'm like, no, I will give her credit for allying with us to support us after decades of advocacy that we did. I can give her credit for that, but I can't give her credit for peer respites in general. And then like more broadly, we see that Sherry Mead, who's great, who's a creator of intentional peer support, which is this really powerful training that we absolutely are very invested in. She was given credit for starting the first peer respite and continues often to be given credit for the first peer respite in 1995. It's called Stepping Stone. It's in New Hampshire. It actually just closed in the last couple of years, which was sad. But, as much as I appreciate Sherry's work, when I started to do work with this other project that we are a part of co-founding called the Black Movement Leaders Project, where we're looking for Black people with psychiatric and other overlapping histories who've done really powerful things and taken leadership roles in our movement, because it doesn't get talked about as much as white people, honestly. I found out about Jenny Fulgham. And Jenny Fulgham, I wouldn't know about her if not for Vanessa Jackson having written this book about Black people with psychiatric histories. And there's just this little piece in there about Jenny in the 70s, as someone who had a psychiatric history and also had some property in Virginia, creating this space, this retreat for people with psychiatric histories. I'm like, well, that sounds an awful lot like peer respites. And this is the only picture I can find of Jenny. Most of her history has been lost. And I also want to recognize that Jenny, while I now credit her as one of the early peer respite founders, is, I'm sure, not alone. I'm sure there's so many stories that we'll never hear because of who gets platformed, whose stories get recorded, whose stories get retold. And so I like to mention that. And I also, just for those of you who've been told to pay lots of attention to evidence-based practice, which is pretty much all of us, right? There's problems there too, intersecting with systemic oppression. And just a quick example, although this has begun to shift a little bit, for many years, up until quite recently, around 80% of the people who got their studies published in research journals in the field of psychology were white. And it's not that different now, it's just begun to shift. And the people that they were including, whose experiences they included in their research, 6% and less of them were not white. And there's good reasons for that in terms of the mistrust that has been built between Black and Brown people and research in this country. Also, frankly, with people with psychiatric histories and research in this country. And so it makes sense in its way, but it should tell us, should flag for us that we are ignoring hundreds of years of people's ancestral practices, of the knowledge, of the wisdom that they carry with them in the name of looking at things through one very specific experience and lens. And if you haven't already seen it, one film that I like to direct people to is called Crazy Wise. And Crazy Wise is an imperfect film in many ways because Phil Borges, who's one of the filmmakers, he's a white man and he tells many of the stories of the Black and Brown people he includes. And I've had a chance to talk to him and sort of like push on some of that. And, I understand, he explained that part of that is because he was taking footage for something else entirely and decided to make this film later and hadn't captured those stories in the way. So it's got that imperfection, but the strength of it is really around Gogo Akaya Asama's story. And Gogo Akaya lives in California, and she is someone who was really struggling, was hearing voices, was in and out of hospitals, had a very long, difficult history in the US mental health system until she was able to reconnect with her ancestors and her heritage and find other people. And this is, there's again this sort of like commonality of experience that's so important in peer support. Other people who had the same history, the same ancestral lineage, who could say, like, this is a practice. You can use these energies in this way. And she now has this really incredible life sharing that with other people and really not involved with the mental health system. You can also find her in the Black Movement Leaders Project. Now, I want to talk about harm reduction because harm reduction often gets sidelined into being about drugs only, being about a very limited set of experiences, when in fact, harm reduction really underpins a lot of what good peer support looks like, and I think a lot of what good help looks like in general. I don't want to go any further, though, without recognizing that where harm reduction comes from is, from things like the AIDS crisis in the 1980s and before that even, and really historically comes from marginalized communities who've kind of been left in their moments of greatest crisis. So typically Black and Brown people, queer people, sex workers, drug users, to figure it out for themselves or die, honestly. And so that's where harm reduction really comes from. And I want to make sure that I'm clear about that. I also want to recognize that sometimes people get confused when they're talking about harm reduction, and there is what I call harm reduction with capital HR and harm reduction with lowercase HR. And I'm not going to read all of this to you. It's there again for your reference. But what I mean here is the harm reduction I was just talking about that comes from that history and that capital HR is a real shift in philosophy based on very clear principles and ways of supporting people. And the lowercase HR, sometimes people confuse with it, is more like, oh yeah, someone's in this really terrible environment and I brought them something to make it a little easier to be there. Like that still can be valuable, to bring someone in a psychiatric facility their own clothes, for example, but it's not this like fundamental shift in how we interact with and support people and talk about their struggles. So harm reduction from that principled place, that capital HR place, is really about the radical acceptance that someone doing or experiencing something that you might perceive as risky or maybe actually indisputably risky still gets to choose how they live, and that we're going to walk along with them and support them to live a full life anyway. And maybe more than anything, it's coming back to that power piece again, letting go of the power to identify what someone's problem is and how and when they should respond or if they should try and change, and just walking with them to support them to clear their way to live the life that they want to live. Now, I'm not going to go through these in detail. That QR code, if you're interested, will get you to these on the actual National Harm Reduction Coalition website. But I wanted to give just a quick reference point to what the 8 principles actually are. And as you can see, they focus on acceptance rather than judgments, that they recognize that when we talk about things like self-injury, voices, drug use, etc., that it runs a whole range of experiences. This idea that everything is the same, that comes from a lack of sort of willingness to really sit with and understand what's happening for people. It avoids coercive supports and fors, centers the voice of people who've lived these experiences. It recognizes the role of inequities and systemic oppression in how people came to have these experiences and the access to resources that might support them to move through them. And it doesn't romanticize, we can still talk in real ways about the potential risks and losses, but within this framework. And what that actually ends up looking like in just a few examples I've pulled out here, for example, is in hearing voices, the goal does not have to be to stop hearing voices. Many people will tell you that the voice hearing experience is actually a positive, and probably most people, especially if they've been in the mental health system, will say it's a mix. Sometimes it's negative, sometimes it's positive, but actually even the negative voices, when there's space to understand them, end up being messages. I have a coworker who talks about when she sees crying babies, it used to terrify her until she began to understand that that baby showed up in environments that felt safe, and it was a warning. And it allowed her, instead of being afraid, to look at the environment and take action and potentially change her environment. It also lets us have conversations like, how do we use strategies like, oh my gosh, if I were in the middle of this presentation and I was hearing a voice and that was preventing me from saying what I wanted to say to you, can I make an appointment with that voice? And that might sound silly, but it's actually something that works for a lot of people. It's like, hey, I hear you, I want to listen to you, but can we do this at 5 o'clock? Because I'm in the middle of something right now. Or, for example, picking up a phone and turning it off so it doesn't ring, but pretending to talk on the phone and talk to a voice that you're hearing may prevent people from around you getting freaked out and putting you in a psych facility that's going to cause more harm than good. And you can see those sorts of things, similar sorts of things, going through these 3 different areas that I've highlighted here. I'll jump down to suicide. I do a ton of training on suicide, and we use something called alternatives to suicide, which is coming from a harm reduction perspective, and it's all lived experience created and harm reduction focused. And it's, again, doesn't have to be about getting rid of the suicidal thoughts that someone has. And I know that might freak people out as well, but I've talked to people. I remember particularly one man from a training that I was facilitating, he said, I don't want my suicidal thoughts to go away entirely. That darkness is part of what drives my art and my music. If I lose touch with that, that's not a good thing. I just want to have a greater sense of control so they don't overwhelm my life. And that's very much a harm reduction approach. Now, as far as peer support, if you are someone who's coming here who's less familiar, I just want to kind of go over some of the real core basics of what it is. Of course, it's all about people who've been there, who, if they're in a formal peer support role, have been trained to use the wisdom gained from surviving to support others on a similar path. That's basically it. But it also focuses on connection and minimization of power imbalances. And I'm going to tell you right now, some of the certified peer specialist trainings that are through this country have not been created by people who actually have lived experience, and they don't always carry these messages forward. So there is a real issue with co-optation, which is not uncommon when you consider how systemic oppression and marginalization works. But other pieces of it mean that it's not about advice giving, it's about exploration and partnership. It's not about assessment, it's about exploring meaning. It's really not about carrying out a provider's agenda, it's about supporting people to get heard. And it's not about observing or watching people. Again, it's like looking for real choices. And, you can see the rest here, but within a peer support environment, it was the first time I really had the freedom to talk openly about the fact that none of the psychiatric diagnoses I've ever been given have actual meaning to me. And here's how I've made meaning of my experiences. And that was important to my healing, not just, to getting to say that out loud, but an important part of my healing has been getting to redefine my experiences in ways that make sense for the context of my life. And while I've always carried that knowledge within me, doing that without having other people to talk to who kind of get it and make that space is harder than you might think. Sometimes that knowledge stays buried until those conversations are able to happen. And that's a huge part of what peer support is. Now, I've already talked about some of this. It's really here for more for your reference so you can see some other kinds of questions that you might ask people who are having experiences. And I will tell you, really well-framed questions can be life-changing for people because it can help them discover some of that stuff that I said was buried. It also can mean sharing other people's experiences. So you might not be aware of this, maybe you are, but in the world of self-injury, there are actual books out there that are free online for people who have self-injured themselves, who've written on how to do it safer. And that might freak a lot of people in the world out, but it's how to cut and not end up in the ER where they might force you into a hospital, how to cut and not actually do more damage than you meant to do, those sorts of things. Those are important conversations in the harm reduction world that can allow someone to continue to use something as coping and not have it actually interfere with their life. And one thing I always like to say to people about self-injury in particular, since it's played such a big role in mine, is I would argue that almost everybody self-injures. However, some people do it in socially acceptable ways, and some people do it in ways that are not socially acceptable that can land you in a forced psychiatric hospitalization. And I will tell you, for me, I used everything from alcohol to food to exercise to overworking to cutting to burning and so on. And if I really step back and look at it, the things I did with food, alcohol, drugs that were actually more socially acceptable, particularly the food and alcohol and over exercising at one point, caused more long-term harm to my body than the things that people decided were the problem for me. Now, in terms of working together and partnering together, one of the things I would ask those of you who are going to do this work and looking at integrated environments, and this might not be what you want to hear, is to support them not to be integrated environments whenever you can. Because actually, when peer support roles are required to function under a system that doesn't fully understand them and that just doesn't know what it doesn't know, co-optation is much more frequent. And where it doesn't happen, it's usually because there's like one or two champions in there that really get it. And when they leave, it tends to revert back to co-optation. I mean, that's the difference between systemic change and, just change in the moment. Where that's not possible, subcontracting. So we have a contract with a psychiatric facility where we hire and train people and supervise people, and then they go into that psychiatric facility. That can make a real difference. And where that's not possible, advocating in your environments for people to have really senior leadership roles who are coming from that peer support world and can also supervise people. And, you sort of see as it goes, wherever there can be as much separation and power shared, that is going to reach it's just going to hold the most integrity for peer roles. And you'll see in my little arrow at the right of this slide where most peer roles exist is honestly below that point. This is just not happening in many areas. And part of that also goes to the fact that many peer support organizations haven't been given the support to develop or the funding to be fully realized in what they can offer too. So there's ways in which financial access really perpetuate this as well. So if you have an opportunity to make a shift there, then that's really great. I'll also say that if you are in an integrated environment, whatever you can do to support peer supporters to not have to go to meetings that violate their code of ethics and their values, like sitting and talking to people without them present, having to look through their permanent records or make notes in those permanent records, those sorts of things really run against the value of being there for the person rather than the system, which is a lot of what peer support is. Making sure that peer supporters get access to trainings that are specific to peer support, interrupting psychiatric oppression when you see it, and staying humble and deepening your own learning whenever you can. And as partners, I really hope that you'll consider getting really good at explaining what each other's roles are and why they're both important, and rather than needing to give up pieces. And usually the one that gets lost or chipped away at is the one in the peer support role. Establishing ways to check in and make sure that roles have integrity, because if you're not checking in, things drift faster than you think. You can see the rest here, just sort of some practical thoughts on how do you really support each other to do the roles as they were intended. And sometimes I will say what interferes is that people in more, in other provider roles are like, well, why don't they have to take notes? Why don't they have to do this? Why don't they, and I fully want to recognize that providers' roles are also harmed by some of the system's requirements and focuses on notes and measurable goals and the way our funding systems work. But I also hope that we can join in this agreement that having a role that's separated out from that really gets to not be under that pressure is good for us all. And so, I just hope in that partnership that you all have that you can look at that. Now, I want to tell a quick story that hopefully brings us all home, and then I'm going to be quiet and see what questions there are. So this is a story of David, and David was actually somebody who was told to call me several years ago before I knew who he was. First phone call, I'm at the same desk that I'm sitting at now. My phone to my left rings, and I pick up the phone, and this person named David says, "The Department of Mental Health told me to call you because you would have the answers." And I'm like, uh-oh, like, I don't even know what the question is, and I probably won't have the answers when you tell me. And what he really wanted to tell me was that he was suicidal. I didn't have to ask if he had a plan, which is, by the way, a terrible question to ask people. And I know everyone's trained to do it, not just providers, like everyone in the society is trained by things like mental health first aid and all that to ask that question. But I will tell you right now, when people ask me, do you have a plan? What I do is I identify them as a threat, because they are evaluating me for whether or not I'm going to have my liberty taken away. So in any case, I have to ask him that. He just told me he had a plan, told me what he's going to do. And he just, I think, kind of wanted to hear what my reaction was. And because I work where I do in this peer support world and I'm in a leadership role, I got to say, David, I'm never going to be somebody who tries to take power away from you. I'm never going to try and force you, no matter what you say or how scary it is. You can just talk. And so he did. He talked to me on the phone, then in person, on Facebook. He's the one who taught me that you can send those voice messages. When I opened up my Facebook, and I had a pile of them all maxed out in their time from him. And everything was going well, and I kept to my promise, except he kept picking up on the fact that I was really still hanging on to this agenda that I was going to figure out what to say to get him to stop being suicidal. Wasn't going to use force, but I was going to try and find the magic words or things to do to convince him that he wanted to go on living. And he would get mad at me. He said, "You have not fully accepted. You're not actually listening to me. I said I'm going to kill myself." And he was right. And so I had to take a break and go away and talk to others about what am I doing? How do I let go of this agenda? And I got some support around that and got to think about that. And then I came back and I asked him a question. And first I said, David, you're right. I hadn't fully accepted this, and I'm doing everything I can to fully accept this now, that you're going to die, you're going to kill yourself. But I want to ask you a question first. Is there anything you want to do before you die? And he said, yes. He was an artist He was a photographer, and he wanted to create an art show that would be his mark that he would leave on this world, and he wanted me to help him with it. And so he sent me a Dropbox full of photographs, and we talked about which ones would work for the show and which ones wouldn't work and which ones he still wanted to go out and take. And that was not just a one-time conversation, it was a conversation that lasted over the course of a couple of weeks. And by the end of it, he had reconnected with his own sense of beauty in the world and his own reason for wanting to stay. And my message here is not like, oh, that's the question. Just ask everyone who's suicidal what they want to do before they die and everything's good. The message is, had I not let go of trying to control things, had I not let go of my own agenda and just made space for how David was, we wouldn't have gotten there. We just wouldn't have. And his life changed fairly rapidly after that. He had been suicidal in part connected to living out of his car and feeling hopeless about that. He got a job that came with housing. And the reason you see him in some of his photographs here, though, is he did end up dying. And it wasn't by suicide. And this is the tragedy of life, right? Like in the tragedy of life, sometimes you finally decide you want to live and that choice is taken away from you. So not long after he got that job and shifted in where he was at with wanting to live, he had a heart attack followed by a stroke that he did not survive. And so as a part of carrying my promise to him forward, I do show some of his photographs and I share some of his story, which I think about, and I have more David stories than just this one. I've learned a lot from him. I continue to learn a lot from sharing these stories. But for me, that's harm reduction and that's peer support in a nutshell. And I have, I think, a little bit of time for questions.
You do. I got what a beautiful story to end on. And just that piece around giving up that commitment to our own agenda and how powerful that can be in allowing the client to, or the person working with you, in our case, it'd be clients, right, to really find their path to where they need to go and what they need and like reconnect with the beauty in life. Yeah, thanks. I'm going to be sitting with that for a while. So I am actually going to bring our grad assistant Jason because they have a question to ask you. And then I will go to the Q&A and come ask follow-ups once you get through that one.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I think so much of it really resonated with me and really hits on a lot of things I've been thinking of since joining this program as someone with a peer support background as well. And I guess my question for you is, I think a lot of folks in this webinar are therapists. You know, some of us might have a peer support background or lived experience. And I guess I'm wondering, obviously, a therapist role is in some ways incongruent with peer support. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how peer support values can be brought into therapy.
Yeah, I mean, we actually train a lot of clinicians these days, and we're training them on very similar approaches to what we use with peer support. And I think that, some of what needs to change are the provider organizations that people are working in that create this sort of very inflexible way of being with people. But I think that we use this approach called VCVC, and it focuses on validation, curiosity, vulnerability, and community. And I don't have time to get into what that all means, though some of it's pretty self-evident, but the willingness to stretch the pressures to report or respond in particular ways and make as much space for that curiosity and the vulnerability. Now, people in therapist roles might not be able to share as much as a peer supporter, but they can still share, usually can get away with like, yeah, like when I was feeling really angry at one point in my life, it was because someone hurt me. Has someone hurt you? Like there's still ways to share without getting into the depth and the details that provider organizations might not want. And I think as much of that people can do to humanize, I think that's important. And I will also say, as someone who at one point kind of hid my history and worked in the clinical environment, I would say even if people don't have peer support backgrounds, there's a huge number of people working in clinical roles who do have trauma experiences and their own struggles, and wherever they can connect with that and really think about how are they impacted. We actually have, we have a number of clinical people showing up to our alternatives to suicide groups because they can't talk about it in their work environments, but they need to. And so making those connections and reflecting on those experiences can be really valuable.
Yeah, the word vulnerability in there was just so I think that there's there's a vulnerability in being, bringing that humanity forward and not hiding behind like these are the roles, responsibilities, and expectations, but really kind of, yeah, meeting everyone where they are and sharing that piece. Yeah. And even as you're saying, right, yeah, most folks in mental health, it's not a full overlapping circle, but like being
Yeah.
impacted by mental health and trauma and those things. The majority of us, I think, in the field have some of that background.
Yeah. And I would also say just challenge the policies you're told. Some people are told that liability is a huge risk, but there's a woman named Susan Stephan, who's an attorney, who looked at liability for non-prescribing clinicians, and it's way lower. The
Mhm.
likelihood that you're going to be held responsible for what someone else does is way lower. So really look at those things. It creates a lot more flexibility.
Yeah, it's been making me really, really happy to see that. Like one of the, um, I don't know, maybe you want to call it like a positive effect of the pandemic. I don't know, but like I'm trying to find a better word for it. But it seems like when we lost access to hospitals during that period, a lot of the standard professional training started looking at how to manage suicidality or those kinds of things in an outpatient way, which has been like so like some of the top trainers in the most medical model kind of things are now saying no, you don't have to, don't refer for that. Like, let's do, which is, and then needing to draw on and now co-opting and claiming as though they invented it themselves, the
Right.
harm reduction and the management. That is, I really appreciated your attention to that in here and even bringing in, was it Jenny in the Zuni Federation? I have never heard of that. And that was incredible to hear. I put the link to your project in the chat for folks. That was amazing. I can't wait to read more of that. So,
Thank you. Yeah, and natural disasters are great for forcing change. People don't think, I hate to say it, but in Vermont, when the state hospital got flooded, that's when the state decided to fund their Soteria project. And Soteria actually comes out of California as well with Lauren Mosher, but it's a very alternative, not non-clinical, but very alternative way of approaching folks that, yeah, so sometimes, unfortunately, we need something terrible to disrupt our idea of what needs to be.
all right, we have one more question in the chat that just came in, which is the mental health recovery model is often assumed to be aligned with the peer support model. Do you have any thoughts on the recovery model and its alignment with peer support?
I mean, it depends on whose hands the recovery model is being defined. What does that even mean? It's not a very well, there's no way where to look and say, oh, this is exactly what it is. And honestly, the language of recovery, I actually have an article on Mad in America about the recovery trap. And so for me, when people ask me how long have I been in recovery, I'm like, well, how do I answer that? Like, is it the first time I was in therapy, the last time, first hospital, like, what are we counting exactly? And what I now say to people is, why is what you get to call life with all its ups and downs what I'm supposed to call recovery for the rest of my life? Because I was in a system at one point and had diagnoses at one point. And for me, it feels like another box that attaches me to a system. And so I think that there's all sorts of challenges with that, even with that word, among people with psychiatric histories, among autistic people, a number of different experiences. And so that's a challenge. And then, like I said, it's just like, yeah, I've seen a lot of different definitions of what that actually means. And in the wrong hands, or what I would define as the wrong hands, basically people who haven't been there themselves, it's getting defined again as like, do people have the potential to move forward if they follow the rules of the system and accept their treatment? Sometimes it's defined as that. I think it is consistent if you just pull out this one idea of people have all sorts of potential to have full lives. If that's the only piece we're holding, then absolutely. But there's a lot of other stuff that gets layered in there.
Well, we are in our last 60 seconds, so no more new questions. I did notice in the chat, though, you got some really positive feedback. This is bookmark the website. This has been an exceptional presentation. Thank you. So yeah, I really, really appreciate this. Yeah, lots of folks kind of chiming in with their gratitude for that. So thank you for all the work that you're doing. Thank you for reminding us of the importance of who gets attribution for the work and for doing that. Just, yeah, keep that all in and to continue challenging us to think about who's being harmed, who's getting voice, who's not, and how are we co-opting or using, connecting with folks well and managing power. Really appreciate that. Any
Thank you.
last thoughts you want to share before we wrap for the day?
Oh gosh, I think I'll just say thank you.
Yeah.
I really appreciate the opportunity. And please do feel free to reach out to me. That QR code will get to you to a bunch of stuff. And I think someone put my email in the chat as well. So
Yeah, thank you again. It's been wonderful. Have a wonderful weekend. Don't forget to do all your evaluations, folks, if you want the CE credits. And yeah, just much appreciation to everyone today. Take good care.